英語会話。
Hello everyone. Welcome to our English conversation program. How are you? I hope you're fine. Today, Biff and I are very happy to be back to present to the second half of this month's guest hour from the city of Nara, one of the most beautiful traditional cities in Japan. And I'm sure the lovely deer in the park here would like to extend their greetings.
Hi everyone. Here with us in the Nara studio is George Istead, Assistant Professor of English at the International Buddhist University in Osaka. It's certainly a pleasure to be back with you today, and to begin with, please let me briefly summarize what we discussed last week for those of you who are unable to join us. First of all, Professor Istead majored in Asian Studies as a college student, and during that time, he was fortunate, I think, to be able to spend a year studying at Waseda University. And it was during that time that he became interested in teaching English to Japanese. So today, we'd like to hear his ideas about language learning. Professor Istead, it's certainly nice to have you on our program again.
I'm happy to be back. Hello, everyone.
I'd like to begin by asking your opinions about language learning, since last week we focused on your more personal background. I'm sure you have lots of advice to give our listeners, but I'd like to begin by asking your experiences as a student, and I'm wondering if while you were learning Japanese you had any interesting things happen to you.
Don't we all? I was perhaps a little bit fortunate in being able to begin my study of Japanese in high school. Mm-hmm. And in American high school and in college, as a matter of fact, we used some very, very traditional methods of teaching. And while I was over there, I thought that I was a very, very good and competent user of Japanese. That was until I came to Waseda. And I remember arriving in Haneda and going to the monorail. Mm-hmm. And when I bought my ticket to the monorail, I looked around and I didn't see a wicket. Mm-hmm. And so I asked the man, well, how do I get into the monorail? And he says, well, just go down the hall and turn to the left. Well, in Tokyo, when they say left, they say shidari. Mm-hmm. And I didn't understand what shidari was. I looked in my dictionary, S-H-I-D-A-R-I, and there wasn't any. Mm-hmm. And to make a long story short, of course, people in Japan simply don't pronounce Japanese the way the tapes did back in the United States. And from that point, for the next 6 months, I had considerable trouble in polishing my hearing. Then another thing that happened also at Waseda was when I went into my classes, and I took the entrance placement test, and they placed me in a very high level. Mm-hmm. For some reason, I don't know why. And I got into the class, and we were reading some Japanese literature, but my reading was very, very slow. I knew all of the characters, but I just read them very, very slowly. And so my teacher gave me a copy of Bochan by Mr. Soseki. Mm-hmm. And he told me, I want you to read this book within 1 week. But you can only read it on the train.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I thought so too. And he says the reason is simply this, that you don't know how to read Japanese. You know many characters and you know grammar, but you simply can't read. And if you get on the train, number one, you can't take notes. Number two, you can't use your dictionary. Mm-hmm. And so you have to read. And so through that experience, I think I learned how to read Japanese.
So it sounds like then wide reading or extensive reading is also important for increasing fluency in, say, listening or speaking a language.
Yes, I think so, because reading and listening, of course, are both input functions of language. Mm-hmm. And for your brain to take in English, for example, there are two ways. It can take it in through the eyes via reading or through the ears via listening. Mm-hmm. But the two, I think, are very, very similar. And especially for students who don't have an opportunity to listen to natural English, to have foreigners there that they can talk to all the time, they can get a certain amount of input practice or listening practice, I think, by reading.
Mm-hmm. And Professor Istead, by turning the tables even further, and in what area of language skills then do you think Japanese students need to work harder?
Well, I think, we'll say it again, listening, yes. This comes from actually several different problems I think I've seen Japanese have, not only Japanese, but also Americans and other foreigners learning the Japanese language as well. But unless you can listen, you can't carry on a conversation. And many of the students that I talk to on the trains or in schools or here and there are very good at composing questions, but they don't understand the answers. And so I find I have to make the answers very simple in order to continue a conversation. So I think that before anything else, Japanese students need to study very hard in polishing their ears, so to speak. Also, the Japanese education system itself places very little emphasis on listening. Recently, fortunately, many high schools are giving listening exams on their entrance examinations, and colleges are doing the same, so the problem is being alleviated a little bit. But still, the ears of our students, I think, are far from what they need to be in order to communicate.
And it seems to me that nowadays, Professor Istead, we have literally tons of English language teaching materials, such as books, tapes, records, and radio or TV programs, including this course, of course. And could you give our students some advice on how to select the good materials and how to utilize them, to increase fluency in speaking, or even to be able to listen to English when it's spoken naturally, I mean?
Oh, that's a very dangerous question, I think. If I say Professor A's book is good, then Professor B will be angry. But in fact, I think that I have never seen a bad book in the bookstore, and I've never really heard a bad tape. On the other hand, some methods are good for some students and bad for others.
You mean, excuse me, about your study of Japanese, or?
No, about my study of English, yes. Looking at all of the different tapes and methods and books and records available, most of them are very good for the purpose they're designed for. But the problem seems to come mostly from the students choosing something which isn't appropriate for themselves. And I think when a student goes to select a text or a set of tapes to study from, he first has to think about what he wants to get from his study. And then look for the materials which will help solve his own problems. Every method has its own area in which it's trying to improve the student's English. And if there's a mismatch, of course, the students won't be satisfied with the results. But definitely, I think that a student has to follow one particular methodology in his own studying. Jumping around from one to the other will produce a very hodgepodge type of English. But I think that kind of study is only half of the study the student needs to undertake. And the other half, I think, is simply immersing oneself in real English. And to a certain extent, fortunately, in Japan today, I think the students can make their own tapes. If you're living in Tokyo, for example, we have FEN, which you can get on any radio station, any radio. If you have a shortwave anywhere in Japan, you can pick up BBC or the Voice of America or any number of different shortwaves and literally take an English tape around with you wherever you go. Also, fortunately, we have bilingual television. And if a student is fortunate enough to have a bilingual video tape recorder, this can also be a very good source of teaching materials to help polish the listening. But the important thing, I think, is to get a balance between the study for study's sake and the practice. And I think the practice element is that which the students don't get quite enough of.
Do you have any suggestions about what students, particularly students living outside of large metropolitan areas, can do in terms of practice to use the English that they've studied?
Yes, that's a big problem. Of course, people living in Tokyo are very fortunate because there are many, many foreigners and many places where foreigners hang out. There are many other things available that they can use for their study. As I just mentioned, the shortwave, I think, is a very good way to get natural English listening material. Also, the bilingual television. But another thing that I think Japanese students very often shy away from, and that is literally talking between themselves. Because a person is a foreigner doesn't necessarily make him a good teacher, and it doesn't necessarily make him a good conversational partner. Whereas two students getting together could be excellent teachers for each other. This, I guess, also brings up the problem of whether students should be listening to other students making mistakes and perhaps learning those mistakes, which will bring us around to another problem. What is correct English? What is good usage? What is the best pronunciation? And I think many of your students always wonder, is British English better than American English, or is Australian English better than Canadian English, or which is really the best English, because there are so many varieties. And I think students shouldn't be worried about that so much.
As long as it's intelligible.
Yes,
right?
Practice where you can, and if you can communicate in English, that should be the objective.
So your idea is that if the student has a friend who can speak in English, that they should use the chance and speak in English together to use what they've learned.
Right, as much as possible.
I know that a lot of students in Japan think that the best way to study English is to study in a foreign country. If that's true or not, I'm not sure. But in any case, I think some students who do have that opportunity are sometimes rather disappointed with the results. So do you have any advice about, for those students who are going abroad to study, the most effective way to use their time abroad?
Well, that all depends really on how much time they have abroad, I think. But I think there are some very important points that a student, if they're really seriously interested in improving their English, should take into account. One of those is to try and pick a small city. Many students go to Honolulu or San Francisco or places which have large, either Japanese populations or large
non-English speaking people.
Or whatever, right? And also large cities seem not to be as friendly, or they won't help out such students as easily as small towns will. And I think by getting away from the large cities, the students can be able to contact more people who will earnestly help them an awful lot more. Another important thing is, I think, is if at all possible to go alone. I always notice, of course, the parents are involved too, but many students go in either groups of 2 or 3, or worse than that, in groups of 30 or 40 on a giant package tour. And of course,
they stay together among their friends.
Oh, yes.
And talking all the time in Japanese.
Right, except when they have to. And when they have to, usually the strongest person gets the practice and the other two follow behind. So I think going alone, or even if you go with someone else, to try and stay away from that person as much as possible so that you can use the language as much as possible. Also, I think Japanese are very shy sometimes. And they tend to be, as we call in English, loners. And they don't easily mix with foreigners. They sit in their room at home and they read books and they study, and they really don't get out and learn the language. They don't have an opportunity to contact the language, I think. But the most important thing, I think, is simply, if you go overseas, don't study.
Get mingled.
Yes,
that
right.
sounds like a paradox.
Yeah, that's right. If you party or read all different kinds of comic books or magazines or those kind of things which are basically not study-oriented.
Well, that certainly helps to increase exposure to
watching television
English
programs. If you have an opportunity to have a homestay, for example, spend the afternoon with the children watching cartoons in front of the television set. All of these kind of things can be very beneficial, I think, in increasing language exposure.
Oh, yes, that's right. Well, Professor Istead, I'm sorry to say, but that's all the time we have today, and we really enjoyed listening to you, and we certainly hope we have another chance of getting together. And thanks very much indeed for being with us.
Thank you.
Everybody, this concludes today's guest hour. So long.
Goodbye for now.
Goodbye.
担当は東後勝明先生。お相手はベス・ヒギンズさん。ゲストはジョージ・アイステッドさんでした。英語会話を終わります。